นะโมตัสสะภะคะวะโตอะระหะโตสัมมาสัมพุทธัสสะนะโมตัสสะภะคะวะโตอะระหะโตสัมมาสัมพุทธัสสะนะโมตัสสะภะคะวะโตอะระหะโตสัมมาสัมพุทธัสสะพุทธังธัมมังสังฆังนัมมัสสามิ Blessings, good evening to you all. There was one time during the last period of Luang Por Chah's life, when many of the monks, including myself, helped to nurse him and look after him. There was one occasion when Luang Por Phut, who was a friend of a contemporary of Ajahn Chah's, who had a close connection with the area of Ubon and particularly that forest that Ajahn Chah eventually settled in and built his monastery. Luang Por Phut had visited it earlier. That's a long time ago now, back in the 1950s. But he had had a close connection with Luang Por Chah, and he came to visit Luang Por Chah when Luang Por Chah was ill, and he was asking after the health of Ajahn Chah, his condition, his symptoms, and then he meditated with Luang Por Chah in his room. And afterwards explained to the monks that Luang Por Chah, being a fully awakened being, his mind was completely independent of suffering as an experience. His mind was pure, radiant, not suffering with any more attachment or ignorance. And perhaps this was one reason why Luang Por Chah was able to survive so long, so ill for so long, because he had a pure mind, and when the time was appropriate, he could separate his mind from his body to give it a rest, basically give it a break from the pain and suffering of his body, which was degenerating rapidly and bringing him, no doubt, a lot of painful feeling to have to endure. But nevertheless, when things were quiet, he could rely on what we call vihara dhamma, the dwelling place of the mind, that people who have attained deep states of samadhi or a state of awakening can access and get a rest from the pain and suffering of their own five khandhas. So Luang Por Phut explained this to the Sangha, that this is how Luang Por Chah's mind was, that it was free, peaceful, even though his body was suffering basically and degenerating with age and with time. But he also came over to visit the monks at Wat Panana Chat, and he suggested that one good thing the Sangha could do for Ajahn Chah was to chant regularly for Ajahn Chah, and particularly the chant we call the Vipassana Bhumi. This means the sphere or the area of Vipassana. Bhumi means area, location, sphere, or land even. Vipassana means clear vision, so the land of clear vision, or the areas of clear vision. And it's a chant that is recited at Buddhist funerals sometimes. It's from the Abhidhamma, what we call the Buddhist psychology. And there's some debate whether the Abhidhamma came from the Buddha or not, came afterwards or not. nevertheless it's the tradition, Buddhist tradition, to recite the various books and recitations from the Abhidhamma at funerals. People come together in a Buddhist funeral, there'll be what we call funeral chanting, Mattika chanting, and sometimes that includes the Vipassana Bhumi as well. But we used to chant it for Ajahn Chah once a week on the observance days. Chant Paritas, chant the Vipassana Bhumi, chant for Ajahn Chah. So Luang Por Phut encouraged us to do that, saying that it would help Ajahn Chah to stimulate his wisdom faculty. It's not that he was suffering with craving and attachment and kilesa. He was beyond that. But they say the arahant, the enlightened one, still rejoices in the Dhamma. So just because somebody has become enlightened doesn't mean to say they stop listening to Dhamma teachings or chanting. They still listen to the recitation of the Patimokkha, rules of discipline and so on. They're still practicing the Dhamma, but no longer needing to free themselves from delusion. But for the good of all beings, they continue the practice of Dhamma. So Luang Por Phut suggested that we should chant the Vipassana Bhumi for Luang Por Chah to recollect the Dhamma. Because the Vipassana Bhumi chant is one that sets out the what we call the Paramattha Dhamma, the higher truth, the ultimate truth, that becomes the basis for Vipassana. Clear knowing, clear observation of the truth. So there's 6 spheres, 6 lands in the Vipassana Bhumi. The first is the 5 khandhas. So we talk a lot about that in the suttas. The Buddha talked a lot about the 5 khandhas. Human body, human mind, nama rupa, 5 khandhas, which are the basis for contemplation and observation of the 3 characteristics of existence, which form the basis for Vipassana. So seeing the impermanent nature of this body, this mind, and mental activity. Seeing the unsatisfactory nature or characteristic of it, and seeing the selfless nature of it, the lack of self in body and mind. So this is the starting point for the practice of Vipassana. That has become a term that people use a lot, but I'm not sure they always know exactly what it means. But it's focusing the mind on the impermanent nature of physical and mental phenomena, and the unsatisfactory nature and the selfless nature of physical, mental phenomena. And then there's the what we call the 12 ayatana, sense bases, so the eyes and the object of eyes, which is forms or sights, ears and the object of ears, and so on. So there's the 12 ayatana. Then there's the dhatu, elements. So not only the 12 ayatana, but also consciousness. So you have eyes, and then you have eye consciousness arising when there's a form, a sight to be seen. So you get 3 elements there. And these elements are, again, they're not self, they're impermanent, they're unsatisfactory, they're not self, they're not a being, a person. They're actually just phenomena that exist in nature. So if there's a healthy eye and there's a form to be seen and there's light, then you can get eye consciousness arising. This is an 3 elements. So you get 18 elements when you multiply the 6 senses by 3. So you get the ears, sounds, and then ear consciousness. On you go through the 6 senses. These are all elements, and the point being that they're just things that exist in nature. There is such a thing as an ear the form of the ear, there is a sound to be heard from time to time, and then this ear consciousness or hearing arises. But as you're practicing Vipassana, you're focusing on the impermanent, unsatisfactory and selfless nature of those phenomena and those elements, and you're breaking down, dispersing the sense of self, which is always that solid sense of a being, me, I'm here, body and mind all working together, which we never question or investigate usually. So normally we have a very strong sense of self-identity based on body and mind, or 5 khandhas, 12 ayatana, 18 elements, or the 22 indriyas, another focus for Vipassana, another Vipassana Bhumi. These are faculties. The leading factor in any faculty is, say, like you have that's a good one. It's like mindfulness is a faculty, isn't it? Mindfulness. Samadhi is a faculty. Wisdom is a faculty, meaning mindfulness is the leading factor in the mindfulness faculty. It kind of makes sense. Wisdom, panya, is the leading faculty in the wisdom faculty. The point of seeing indriya or faculties as faculties is, again, you're breaking down the sense of self, a person, and you're seeing the component parts of what we call a human being. You have 22 faculties, many of them overlapping with the indriya and the elements, but there's a few extra ones like femininity is a faculty, masculinity is a faculty, because obviously some people are female, some are male. They have slightly different physical and mental phenomena based on their gender. There's the life faculty, Jivit Indriya. There's the faculties, as I said, mindfulness, samadhi, wisdom, and so on. 22 faculties, all can be the basis for Vipassana insight into the impermanent, unsatisfactory, selfless nature of phenomena. So it's just another way of breaking down the human experience, the human being, into component parts. Then we have the Four Noble Truths. These are basis for Vipassana. There's the previously not knowing the Four Noble Truths, and the knowing of the Four Noble Truths, or knowing what is suffering, what is its cause, what is the end of suffering and the path leading to the end of suffering. So previously one didn't know it, and then one knows it, and then one has known, one has realized the Four Noble Truths. These are a basis for Vipassana, clear seeing. Again, separating out the sense of self, so it's not like I know the Four Noble Truths. There is just the effect of the Four Noble Truths on a human mind. When the Four Noble Truths are penetrated, the human mind is freed from ignorance, and so suffering, the round of suffering is broken. And the last of the Vipassana Bhumis is the Paticcasamuppada, the practice of the contemplation of dependent origination. The way suffering arises dependent on causes and conditions. So beginning with avijja, you get sankhara, karmic formations dependent on ignorance. We make karma. Because of the ignorance conditions, the sense of self, we have a sense of self that makes karma, the will, the doer, good karma, bad karma, karma with our body, our speech, our mind. And this supports the other factors of dependent origination, right down to, again, the ayatana come up again, sense basis, sense contact, feeling arises, perception and feeling arise, and you get craving. Craving is conditioned for upadana, attachment or clinging. It's a condition for bhava, becoming. It's a condition for birth. Birth is followed by aging, sickness, death, sorrow, lamentation, pain, grief, and despair. And the dependently arising or origination of suffering. But then in reverse we have nirodha, the cessation of suffering. When we practice the Eightfold Path, particularly develop mindfulness, wisdom and insight, vipassana, clear knowledge of the selfless nature of phenomena, then we're breaking down ignorance. So we stop making karma, stop creating the causes for craving and attachment and becoming and birth. And so in reverse order, there's the cessation of suffering, the cessation of birth, the escape from samsara and nibbana, or nirodha, nibbana, cessation of suffering. So one simple chant can be unpacked and you get a lot out of it. More than I will explain here in one talk. You have to go off and study it, read about it, listen about it. But it's the basis for vipassana. It's what makes somebody enlightened, by completely penetrating the impermanent, unsatisfactory and selfless nature of phenomena. And this is one way of describing experience that you can use as a basis for that. So Lumpur Put encouraged us to chant it for Lumpur Cha, but maybe also for ourselves. Perhaps we were the ones who really needed to chant that to investigate further and develop our own mindfulness and insight into impermanence, unsatisfactoriness and the lack of self in phenomena. Because if you keep chanting it, some of that wisdom goes in, doesn't it? If you keep chanting the impermanent nature of your five khandhas, you start to notice that form is impermanent. You notice the wrinkles on your skin, the grey hairs. You notice the changing nature of feeling, sometimes pleasant, sometimes unpleasant. You notice the very quick changing nature of perceptions, how you remember and recognize things, constantly changing and tricking you. And obviously you notice the changing nature of the will, the different karmic choices you make, the choices you make, the intentions that come up, some good, some bad. And sense consciousness is constantly changing. These are all conditioned things, and just by reciting, reflecting on these things, you start to notice change. And with change you notice the unsatisfactory nature of body and mind in this world we live in. Where is the reliability in things that are constantly changing and subject to conditions? We'd all like to experience bliss, a perfect world, a perfect life of bliss and happiness, but it's subject to conditions, it's impermanent. This body is constantly aging, so with that you get all the accompanying problems of illness and aches and pains. Feelings constantly changing. You can't have pleasant feelings all day long, much as you would like them. So some people do their best to find pleasant experiences to just occupy the mind and their experience. But it's a constant battle because pleasant feeling doesn't last. How long will it last? It's a whole investigation in itself, a whole practice of vipassana in itself, just observing the arising and ceasing of pleasant feelings. So it's quite a complex chant, quite complex practice, but at the same time it's quite positive to reflect on this, because one thing the Buddha was pointing out is that suffering has its causes. Through ignorance we crave, we attach, we cling to the experience of this body and mind as a human being. We create a sense of self through this clinging, or we call it identity view, and we get a lot of suffering from that. But at the same time, if we develop the opposite, we develop mindfulness, clarity, insight, suffering starts to fade from our experience. So there's an end to suffering. So wherever there is suffering, that's coming from clinging, ignorance and clinging. But wherever we develop mindfulness and insight and wisdom, there's a chance for suffering to fade out from our experience and we can get beyond suffering. So this is a very positive teaching, even though it's quite complex and there's a lot to look at and understand. It's the one thing that you can say gives human beings hope, is that however bad the suffering is, there's always a way out. There's always the cessation of suffering around the corner. And just as suffering has its causes and conditions, the end of suffering also has its causes and conditions. You might say this is what our task is, following the path of the Buddha, is to learn about what leads to the arising of suffering and what leads to the end of suffering. Why not? We are lucky enough to have heard the Buddhist teachings, had them laid out for us. The Buddha did all the hard work. Ajahn Chah and other teachers have also practiced and done all the hard work. Now all we have to do is follow along and prove it for ourselves. So Ajahn Chah used to say when he was alive and teaching, he'd say, contemplate the truth. Learn to pay attention to your experience. Question the truth. Question what's going on in your experience. And you'll notice when you identify to this sense of self, whether it's a happy self or a sad self, an excited self or a bored self, when there's attachment and clinging, we start to suffer. And the mind of non-attachment, non-clinging, is a mind of peace, a mind of true clarity, insight. This often brings up a problem for Buddhists. So we say, well, if there's no self, then who is it who makes karma, and why do we do anything anyway? So in the beginning, we can't practice Vipassana very well. We can't just see the 18 elements, the 12 ayatana, the 22 indriya, the 4 noble truths, the 5 khandhas. We can't just see them as they are, as selfless phenomena. Our starting point is that there is a sense of self. There's me, and I was born, and I have parents, and I was brought up in a certain place. I've got a name, and I've got all the things that I like in life, and all the things I hate as well. That's who I am. We identify with our experience over and over again. So we gradually build up a sense of self-view. This is me. But the thing to do is to start investigating that, isn't it? How real is this sense of self? If I am feelings, and then I should be able to command and control feelings every day to be exactly how I want them to be, to just feel pleasure with the body, and nice intense feelings of pleasure with the mind, to always feel satisfied, stimulated, interested, blissful with the mind. But we can't do that because the nature of feeling is conditioned. When the conditions are right, we can feel bliss and pleasure with the body, with the mind, but when conditions change, they change. It changes. So much of our life we're spent running after pleasant feeling, running away from unpleasant feeling. And you notice that very clearly when you start to meditate, because you're confronted with the reality is that feeling is arising and passing away, and after you've sat for a while, pleasant feeling maybe turns into painful feeling, as the body is rubbing against itself, but rubbing against the floor. It takes effort to sit for a period of time, and that tires us out as well. And our mind maybe is not particularly mindful, so then it's craving to have stimulus, wants to think, wants to imagine things, wants to get up and go away and do other things that seem more interesting, more stimulating to us. We have to deal with that. That's why the Buddha said we need a lot of patience to come and train this mind, because the nature of the very things we're looking at that we identify with as self are constantly changing on us. And that requires endurance, patience to be with. So sometimes, the easier way is to not be with things, to just blank out. So people love to fall asleep when they meditate. Or they go into fantasy, imagining things to get away from the painful feelings they're experiencing. But you'll notice that you get better at it if you keep doing it. All of us find in the beginning there's a lot you have to be patient with, and sometimes it works and we find the patience and the effort, and we bring up some mindfulness, and we can see the changing nature of our experience, and we can say, oh, this is not really me, these are just kind of like waves of feeling arising, passing away, and then we find a certain peace in the knowing of that. And that might be, you could say, the peace of understanding or vipassana. But then other times we can't do it, and the mind is just going crazy because of the attachment and identification with everything as self. It agitates us, it disturbs us, and we find we have an unhappy self, or an angry self, or a worried self. So we have to take things slowly, and we have to build up our patience and build up our skill, but it can be done. Because if you got to the point where you say you're hearing this talk, and maybe you're sitting meditation right here, right now, listening, that means you probably already achieved a certain amount in your meditation. You know how to sit with your own changing feelings, changing thoughts, desires coming and going. You've already achieved a certain amount. It means you can do more. And we've all learned to be with unpleasant experiences to an extent, but then we also have our limits. But as you practice more insight, you start to push boundaries a bit, and you realize things that previously you took as self and identified with strongly, maybe that you don't have to identify so strongly as you become more mindful of them. So, like painful memories that used to make you cry or unhappy when they came up in your mind. After a while, maybe you have enough strength of mindfulness to just know them and let them go. Or desires for pleasure and distraction that previously just took you away from mindfulness, led your mind into fantasies and indulgences. Maybe slowly over time you develop your strength of mindfulness, and you can just see them as desire, arising, passing away. You don't necessarily have to follow. So little by little your mind gets stronger as you practice this, and then there's a chance to really develop what we call vipassana, seeing clearly the true nature of body and mind as not self, not a person, not a being. You might say we start to break up our experience a little bit into chunks or into moments of experience, moments of consciousness, seeing, hearing, tasting, touching, moments of feeling, pleasant, neutral, unpleasant, thought moments of intention and will coming up and then passing away again, and so on. As our insight develops, then we can maybe see the impermanent nature of body and mind, and this changes our whole view of things. It's not that the body disappears. You may temporarily disappear in your meditation. Sometimes when you attain very calm states of samadhi, the body does seem to disappear. You can't feel it anymore. But it won't be long, it will return, because even states of samadhi are impermanent and not self. So you may occasionally find that the body disappears, but what really changes is your attitude and your understanding of it. You're seeing the body as a collection of component parts that break down into these elements. Consciousness is an element. Body is a collection of 4 elements. earth, air, fire, water. Those elements are not a self. It's only by observing closely over and over again that realization starts to become apparent, and then that changes the way you look at this body. It's a relief. You don't have to identify so strongly with it, so then you can practice putting it down, letting it go. You should find a lot of anxiety, depression, grief, sadness disappears as some understanding arises. And why do we have so much suffering and anxiety in life? Is because we're trying to keep this sense of self happy and protected, secure and free from all kinds of unpleasant experiences. But the more you see the conditioned nature of body and mind, the more you realize you can't control everything. You control enough just to try and keep going, keep sort of basically healthy and comfortable, but you realize ultimately you can't control everything because you can't stop the body aging, you can't stop the weather being too hot, too cold sometimes, and feeling hungry and feeling cold and feeling thirsty. You can't make your eyes only see pleasant things all day long. You can try your best, but it'll be impossible because even the pleasant things you get bored with after a while, and then they can even turn into unpleasant things. These kinds of understandings change the way you look at this thing you call self. And it's not that there's nothing there. There's still a body, still a mind that knows things, experiences things, but it's the idea or the view of self that is changing. You're breaking it down, stripping it down into its component parts. So there's not this automatic fear and anxiety that myself is not going to get what it wants, or it's going to have to be with something it doesn't want. You know, how much of our suffering is based on that, the insecurity of self. But if you can see through the sense of self, particularly see the changing nature of self and the idea of self, a lot of that drops away. We become peaceful. So the peace of Vipassana is even better than the peace of just states of calm, samadhi. It's constantly undermining this process of craving and attachment, how it arises, the conditioned nature of suffering. It's being undermined little by little by clear seeing of the way things are. A kind of default, automatic mode of thinking is that there is me, I am, I exist, and this is mine, this belongs to me. So whether it's external, material things and experiences coming in from the outside, or just internally how we feel, how we think, we're always reacting with this sense of grasping at a sense of self. But Vipassana is the opposite. You're breaking that apart, questioning, looking more deeply and seeing, oh, actually it's not what I thought it was. But that brings a relief to the mind, peace to the mind. You don't have to hold on to a sense, cling to a sense of self. It's pleasant. So if nothing else, if we learn one chant, the Vipassana Bhumi, it's not that long, it only takes 5-10 minutes to chant. You can look it up, you can Google it. Learn it, and then start reflecting on it. Yeah. Eyes, seeing, forms. Where is the self in that? Normally it's I'm seeing and I like what I see, or I don't like what I see. And then we start thinking about it and saying, I want more of this and I want to get more and I want to get a slightly better version. Or I hate this and I want to get rid of this, and I wish my eyes never existed in the first place so I wouldn't have to see these things. But learning and have enough mindfulness to just practice Vipassana, there is seeing but there's no one seeing. It's just I consciousness arising and passing away, pleasant, unpleasant feeling arising, passing away. You try it sometimes, just try looking but not wanting anything from what you see and not creating a self around what you see. You're just looking, just hearing. Sometimes people have that realization, there's no me here, it's just I seeing, it's just light, it's just ears hearing, it's just tasting, but there's no self in it, there's no me, mine, myself. And it can be very peaceful. It may not last very long, but it's peaceful. They say when the Buddha taught the Abhidhamma, he taught it to Venerable Sariputta, his wisest disciple. And then Venerable Sariputta would relate it to the monks, and people were getting enlightened, listening to the Abhidhamma of devas and monks and nuns. And they say, all the disciples of Venerable Sariputta, they got enlightened. Previously, there had been bats in a cave. So the legend has it, there had been bats in a cave in the time of Kassapa the Buddha, a previous Buddha. And he had been teaching the Abhidhamma, and those bats hanging from the cave roof, fortunately in the right place at the right time, hearing the Abhidhamma, all became so clear-minded, all their attachment to their bat form disappeared, and they were reborn afterwards in heaven realm, Dusita heaven realm. And then later they reborn and they became monks and they became disciples of Sariputta, and they all became enlightened listening to the Abhidhamma. It can be that powerful. In the world these days, the only bat cave people talk about is what you see in movies, Batman. Over the years, many monks and nuns and lay people even have practiced in caves. Caves are very good places for many people to meditate because they're quiet. So even a bat sitting there listening to a Dhamma talk can become joyful. Maybe it's just the sound of the words of the Buddha. Maybe they didn't understand the actual meaning of the words, we don't know. But the joy arose, the peaceful atmosphere, listening to the Buddha teach. And then they're reborn in heaven. And then later in the life as monks, students of Venerable Sariputta, they completely penetrated the Vipassana Bhumi and became enlightened. No more delusion of self, no more grasping, no more attachment, no more suffering, no more birth. So keep studying this. If you find it inspiring, well, keep reading it, thinking it through. If you don't like to study too much, well, just keep practicing mindfulness and contemplate the rising and ceasing of your experience. Your thoughts arising, ceasing, feelings, perceptions arising and ceasing. Some monks do that. They become enlightened just seeing the arising and passing away of physical and mental phenomena every moment. They're just so dedicated, so mindful, they just keep observing to the point where there's just no sense of self left. It's just body arising and ceasing, feelings arising and ceasing, because that's the nature of body and mind. They just arise and cease. So their mind becomes clear on that, see the truth. Other people like to think it all through, analyze it, work it all out, remember all the terms, debate it, contemplate it, look at it in forward, in reverse. Well, that's okay if that's what you find stimulating brings your wisdom faculty up until you can see clearly, that's fine as well. Other people just like to see arising and ceasing and not think too much about it. Depends on your character. This you might call, people say, what do arahants do? If you're enlightened, what do they do? Well, they contemplate the arising and ceasing of phenomena. They just dwell with wisdom, noting this is the nature of the world. It arises and it ceases. They're not deluded by anything anymore. They're not endlessly creating a sense of self-identity out of their experience. I'm happy, I'm sad, I'm interested, I'm bored, I'm lucky, I'm unlucky, I'm good, I'm bad. They go beyond the conventions. They've gone beyond the conventions of the world and the conventional sense of self. When we're still suffering, it's because we're still trapped in the conventional reality of me, mine, myself. This belongs to me, this is who I am. And because the things we attach to are impermanent, unsatisfactory, not self, we suffer with them. Because we can't control them, we can't make things do what we want. We get older every day, we get pain, we get sickness, one day we've got to die. We can't control that, can we? So we suffer as long as we attach. As long as we're grasping and attaching, we suffer. If you don't want to suffer, then keep doing the Vipassana. Seeing the way phenomena really are. They're impermanent, they arise according to causes and conditions and they pass away. So maybe I'll leave you with those reflections tonight.